All right, hello everybody. Hope that you're doing well today. We have a guest on our stream today. It's going to be great. Oh, that would be the. All right, we know that the sound works because it showed up on the monitor. All right, we have a guest today. This is Alison Morrow. Alison, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Let everyone know who you are.
Yeah, so I am a former TV news reporter. I worked lastly in Seattle, Washington at King 5, which is the NBC affiliate. I was the environmental reporter there for about 5.5 years, general assignment before that, and general assignment at all my other stations. Though I did tend to specialize more in like agriculture, environmental stuff, mostly just because I like hanging out on farms and with animals and whatnot. And really, I was one of the only full-time TV news reporters that covered the environment. So it was sort of a prized position to have because you weren't usually going around covering murders or political controversy. Got to hike and go on boats looking for endangered species and hang out with scientists, and it was really fun. But I got to the point where I wanted to sort of live that lifestyle. I didn't want to keep coming back to the city all the time because I was spending more and more time out in the wild, and I just enjoyed seeing mountains and smelling fresh air. And so my husband and I kind of talked about starting to journey towards a more rural life, and I pitched the idea of letting me do remote work and live in the environment that I was covering, and my bosses thought I was kind of nuts. So I quit and I decided to do YouTube instead. And so I talk sometimes about the environment on my channel, but I really started to do media analysis about maybe 7 months ago or so, mostly because at first when I started my channel, we had bought an Airstream and we were renovating our Airstream to live in, kind of off-grid-ish, that's what we say, because we'll probably never be like totally off-grid, because how do you do Wi-Fi, uploads for YouTube and whatnot, but as much as we can with energy and water and whatnot. And so we were in the process, we still are in the process of renovating that Airstream, and so I was documenting that, but winter would come, we'd have to move, and the renovation would halt, and like, well, how am I going to upload stuff to my channel? We're not doing anything. So, well, I know how to talk about what's going on in mainstream media. I might as well just talk about that. And so I started just showing people kind of how things work behind the scenes. I would point out biases on the different platforms and, the different cable or network news sites and how all that works, and is everybody's theories about the deep state or corporate oversight always correct? Is it sometimes a matter of journalists just not having enough time? Echo chambers, all that stuff. So just kind of gave people an opportunity to pick the brains of somebody that's seen it behind the scenes. I did one video talking about what it was like covering the May Day protests, which turned into riots a lot in Seattle, and that often involved Antifa activists, Black Bloc protesters. And so that was a very hot topic at the time. So I thought I'll just do a video talking about what that was like. That video went bonkers. I went from 4,000 subscribers to, I think, almost 70 within a few days. So it was like, okay, well, now I guess I have tens of thousands of people watching me on YouTube. Now what do I do? So yeah. I just kept doing the media analysis thing, and now I've really started to delve into the world of online speech, mostly because of what we're seeing with the tech companies and their content moderation, what a lot of people, which I sometimes call censorship too. I know in the pure sense of the word, that's not probably correct to call it censorship, but content moderation. And what is the future of that, especially as what we're seeing right now with these certain internet service providers getting totally booted even from devices like Apple devices, and where does this all go? Because I'm a free speech advocate and tend to be someone who wants more speech, not less. And so I've talked about that a lot too, and Section 230 and the sort of restrictions that both political parties have been wanting to put on that. So that's kind of what I do now, but I still like the environment. I still like learning about what's going on out there. I kind of miss my old job every once in a while, but now I get to live in the middle of nowhere, which is what I always wanted to do. So that kind of sums it up.
All right, very good. So when were you in Seattle?
I was in Seattle between I think I moved there at the end of 2013, November 2013, and then I quit in September of 2019.
Okay. And before Seattle, are you originally from the Pacific Northwest, or?
No, I'm from Florida originally.
Oh.
But I've lived all over the country.
Is that where Cheryl Atkinson is from?
From Florida. I did see that she worked in the Tampa Bay market as well, but before me. Yeah, I think she was at WTVT, which is the Fox zone over there. I was at a Scripps owned station, ABC affiliate.
So, because I lived in Seattle from 2001, I arrived September 10th, 2001. So I showed up, was ready for things, and then I woke up the next morning. Of course, I stayed up late the night before. I woke up at like 11 o'clock, and all the news feeds were showing the Twin Towers on fire, and no one would say what had happened. They would just say, they would say, what is happening? And I'm like, how come these buildings are on fire? So it was interesting. It wasn't until probably an hour into the broadcast that someone said, at this time, these two airplanes crashed into these buildings. So that was the day after I arrived in Seattle. And then I stayed there till 2006 as a graduate student in Seattle.
Well, if it makes you feel better, I moved to Paris for my study abroad program on like September 2nd or something, 2001. So, yeah. So like, I believe I was 1 or 2 days into my program. Yeah. When they came into our classroom and said that had happened. And it's interesting though, because depending on where you were in the world, you have a different perspective on what happened afterwards. And so people always talk about like what it was like in the U.S. after 9/11, and I have no experience with that. I was abroad, and so it was interesting to see how Europeans were writing about it and thinking about it, and I miss that whole era.
Yeah, it was. It's been an interesting ride for the last 20 years. Now, when I got to Seattle, it was also just a couple years after the WTO riots, and also I don't remember if it was after I got there or right before I got there, like within a year. There were a bunch of like environmental like extremists that lit the forestry building on fire on the University of Washington campus.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, and that building is right around the corner from the physics building. So,
good Lord. I wouldn't be surprised. I didn't know that, but I guess it doesn't really surprise me in Seattle.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So what was it like doing environmental reporting in Seattle? And in particular, what kind of environmental reporting were you most interested in? To the degree that you got to choose what you did, what were the things that you most were interested in doing?
Well, of course, I like covering wildlife because I like animals. So I covered the southern resident killer whales quite extensively, all the controversy around trying to keep them from disappearing altogether because they were quite endangered. I like doing all of the hikes and, to wolverine dens or take boats out to the middle of the ocean to learn how scientists are testing changes in the water, whether it's temperature or acidification, that kind of stuff. I like that's, I guess, so maybe wildlife, but also just I liked field work, just going and seeing how the people who are working on these issues do their jobs. To me, it's the ultimate non-desk job, especially that's one of the reasons people like being in the news business. If they're a reporter, the producers unfortunately have to sit at a desk, which is when I originally started doing, TV news, I thought I wanted to be a producer because I didn't really want to be on camera, but I did that for a year and I was like, this is terrible. I don't want to sit at a desk. So it's like, it's the ultimate non-desk job. I've hiked in one day, 20 miles, half of which was through snow to the only known wolverine den in the South Cascades with a bunch of scientists and got to pick up scat, and it's just cool. It's documenting history, but being out in the middle of nowhere doing it. So it's the opposite of like what a lot of reporters have been covering over the last year too, with social unrest and political unrest and all that stuff. It's quiet. The wildlife had no political party, no political affiliation.
Wouldn't that be nice?
They don't argue. It's just they're just there, and so it's kind of like you can pretend like things are normal, even though there's a lot of problems out in the wild, but still. That was my favorite part about it.
So did you do much about energy while you were on that kind of beat, like energy in general? So my interest, especially in the last couple of years, has my research is in astronomy and studying like planets orbiting other stars. So some other time we can talk about that. But in the last couple of years, I've really gotten a big interest in energy and like where we get our energy from and what options there are for, how we get it and what effect does that have and what are real solutions as opposed to solutions that are pushed by advocacy groups that are, I'm fine with advocacy groups, but it's important for people to recognize that they tend to advocate for one thing. That's what their job is. And so have you done any kind of reporting on that, or?
You mean energy like solar energy versus wind energy, that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
I did a little bit of that. I would say that I was probably just starting to get into the world of is what they're promising really delivered? Is it as simple as they want it to be? Right when I quit.
Yeah.
So, and that was one of the hard parts about covering this stuff in television news was we had to do so many things so quickly that when it came to really complicated and often partisan issues, you really didn't have the time to understand. It took I guess I should say definitely didn't have the time in one day. So you'd have to cover an issue for a year or 2 years to build up the portfolio where you're like, okay, I really understand what I'm talking about here, because you just don't, in one day, you're basically trying to turn something where you have 4 hours to understand it. And so
you have 4 hours to become an expert in nuclear energy.
And it's funny because we joke about that. Like, yeah, we never know what we're going to be an expert at the end of the day. But the truth is, like, we're not experts at the end of the day. We barely know what we're talking about. Like, one of my old bosses was joking about that the other day. And I think he kind of was being a little serious. Like, you're really an expert. We're not. We're really not. Some of us get to a point of, I would say that when it came to the southern resident killer whales, I was getting pretty close to expertise on understanding the arguments around it and what was happening, because I was covering them ad nauseum. I did a whole month just on the southern resident killer whales, and so eventually I'm starting to understand the complexities and the nuances of what I didn't know before. Right? Like, it's like that level of knowledge where finally you start understanding where your blind spots are, and then you can ask better questions. You're not just regurgitating the same talking points. But with a lot of the other stuff, like with energy and frankly with policies related to energy, that was still a topic that I was grappling to understand. Especially related to, like, obviously in Washington, Governor Inslee, that's one of his really big talking points. And he ran for president on a lot of those platforms, and has been kind of controversial in Washington state for them, because his critics would say that he hasn't achieved what he set out to, but that it's getting more and more expensive to live in Washington, particularly in King County. And so are we achieving the results? That's a debate people can have.
So what was his plan? Like, what was he proposing to do?
Well, he's just, a lot has had to do with taxes. A lot has had to do with increasing, like, car tabs or taxes for one thing or another. And people are just kind of, I just saw, as I was a reporter over the years, people getting a little bit more and more skeptical, and then really, on the more, I don't call it extreme side, but just the more fervently opposed to those policies. People were just like, we can't take your taxes anymore. We're kind of done with this stuff. And, there are much smarter people than myself who are still writing about whether these climate policies that he's had have in fact reduced emissions in the way that he's wanted to. Because it's kind of like the California idea that, you are going to tax people, invest in, green energy, that kind of thing, and we're going to reduce emissions by this % by a certain year. And, You can look up a bunch of articles about whether he's gotten there. Now, of course, the people who support him say we just have, we need more time. We need more time. We need more time. We need more time.
Mm-hmm.
The critics are like, well, it's not working, and we don't need more time to continue a failed policy and just keep taxing people. Let's figure some other option out. And there's a whole wide variety within that debate, but that's basically what it comes down to.
I get a bit of a sense. So I've watched the 2 recent documentaries. I think it was Como that did it. About like the decline of Seattle. And so we left in 2006, and when he's doing interviews with people, they're like, oh, we've been here 20 years and, seeing how like the Bartell Drugs that was downtown is closed up. And I'm like, yeah, I was there 20 years ago too. So I started at the same time they did. And just to see how the city has changed. I mean, at some point, we'll see if they continue going in this direction, but I don't see. It seems pretty sad. And when it comes to like policies, energy policies, my suspicion is that very little in terms of the carbon footprint has actually changed. When you see a lot of, like Michael Bloomberg, for example, he'll do a spiel about the future of green energy, and you have wind, solar, and natural gas, and what it should be is, the green energy that he's discussing is natural gas, wind, and solar is basically the order that goes, because when you have to match the demand at all times. Like electricity travels at the speed of light, or 2/3 the speed of light, and so you have to meet the demand within the light travel time of when it's produced and when it's consumed at the other end, and when the sun goes down and the amount of electricity drops, but the demand for that electricity rises, the only thing you can do is basically turn on jet engines that are driven off of natural gas to make up the difference. And so the footprint for those kinds of things, at least for the time being, is really not a whole lot different than if you just had a natural gas power plant running all the time. And what happens is that things get subsidized. So like we'll pay for this, but the fact that you're subsidizing it is already an indication that the carbon footprint is not what's advertised. So I've looked into it quite a bit, and I'm working on writing it up. Just like where does our carbon footprint come from? Where does society? Where does it? How does it get spent?
I think it's really important to know what we're talking about when we're discussing these issues, because what I found as an environmental reporter is that if you sell the public on environmental policy that ends up being false, or you're gonna shortchange the nuances, I guess, of the conversation. So maybe it's not entirely false, but you haven't been completely honest with what we don't know about it, if we're really going to get this, then you run the risk of people saying, you lied to us, we're never going to believe you again, we're never going to go down this path again.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear anything more about it. So I think it's really important to not overpromise and underdeliver on the environment, because that's how you create enemies and unfortunately lifelong skeptics of potentially real problems that need solutions, and the opportunity to think about them and care about them, because people feel like they were just sold a false bill of goods for so long, they just don't trust anybody anymore, which I think is part of the problem with just generally speaking where people are at this point. And I think, my old industry definitely played a part in folks just being like, you know what, I don't trust any institution anymore, right? I don't trust anybody.
Well, I can say that my opinion of the national media has declined sharply over the last 4 years.
Yeah.
But this reminds me, when you were doing the environmental reporting, were there often, as you got more familiar with the subject, could you see how maybe the reality didn't match what interest groups were promoting? I don't know.
Oh yeah. There were many times where, first of all, one of my very kind of, wow, I had never heard about that before, is we were brought in for a big press conference at the Seattle Aquarium to talk about the bill being introduced to ban plastic bags, which a lot of people probably heard of. It's a topic that's not just unique to Washington State, banning plastic bags at grocery stores and only having paper bags. And so I tweeted something out about it, and somebody wrote me an email that said, "Hey, you should really look into this topic because it's not as simple as they make it sound like. Like it's an equal. You get rid of plastic bags and you save the environment."
Uh-huh.
So I started doing some research, and I remember somebody later, once I started telling people what I found out, which was basically that paper bags, if you include the whole input output process of what it is to create a paper bag versus a plastic bag, that you could make an argument that paper bags are actually worse for the environment than a plastic bag. If you only look at the output, like you only look at what happens with a plastic bag at the end, then you could make an argument that plastic bags are worse than paper bags. So it really depends on where you're starting, what part of the process you're including. Does somebody use a plastic bag multiple times versus a paper bag, which they're not using multiple times? Are they using the paper? What about the input for fertilizers and, all these things? So it was fascinating to me. It's not as simple as just like, paper bag, good, plastic bag, bad. That's how it's often sold to people. But when I was reporting on that, cause wow, I guess, then the people at the aquarium were like, what is she doing? And then I had people writing me saying she's a show for the plastics industry. And, so the second you start questioning the orthodoxy in the environmental world, people look at you like she just don't care about the environment, which is actually exactly the opposite. I cared about the environment so much that I want to make sure that
you're right.
We're not creating enemies of potential allies because we are being so tribal about the way we see things and being so oversimplified with it that when people find out, kind of like, it is almost like it can become like a religion thing. You tell people something that's so oversimplified about history, the world around them, and then they find out that actually there were all these other nuances to it, and then they're like, you know what? I'm done. I'm never going to believe in God again. I'm never going to believe in, any of this stuff because you didn't tell me about these other things that happened. And so I think it's really important to be honest with people about what we don't know, what we do know, about, not being so they're bad and we're good, or this is bad and that's good. And to just, to allow for the conversation, the debate, and the nuances about it, because I think if you're not doing that, it's harder to get people back once they feel like they've been lied to.
Yeah, this is something that I gave a talk at the Las Vegas March for Science a couple years ago, and my talk was basically like a lot of scientists, especially the popular ones, that have kind of made their shtick on, being career like science provocateurs, that they alienate their most important allies. Like the person that you want on your side is the person, like say you're in Kansas and you don't want intelligent design taught as science in the classroom. You need to find the person who's the evangelical Christian who doesn't want intelligent design taught in the classroom, and that's the one that you need to cultivate to advocate for you, because that person will have the connection to the group that needs to be convinced. Where if you take on the persona of, well, anyone who believes in God is a complete moron, and therefore we shouldn't be teaching this in schools, well then, you're not going to win people over. You're just alienating, and you're alienating the people who's your most important ally. Your most important ally isn't the person that's in the choir with you. It's the person, the person on the other side of the aisle who believes in the same thing that you do on that particular issue.
That's a great point.
So when it comes to, this is something that gets brought up. I'm teaching a class called Physics for Future Presidents.
Nice.
And I stole it from a teacher at Berkeley. I use his textbook. And one of the questions that's in that we got into discussion last year when I taught the class was, is it appropriate for scientists to exaggerate the potential upside of their research? And this happened like when stem cells, the stem cell stuff came out in 2001. Like the first topic that George W. Bush had to address was, what do we do with stem cells? And there were a lot of people that were like, this is going to cure Parkinson's, it's going to cure Alzheimer's, it's going to cure every disease known to man. And I really think that in that instance, people did themselves a disservice by overpromising. And so I don't know. It's important for people to be measured in what they do. At the same time, then how do you sell the story?
Yeah.
That's the dilemma. How do you sell the story and simultaneously be realistic in what comes out?
Well, do you think that you can't sell a story without oversimplifying it, or I don't know?
I think you can. I think that you can. I think that you can make reasonable cases you can make compelling cases, but it takes a little bit more thought. And it also, I think, requires maybe a bit more respect for the audience. That outlining the nuance, this leads us in this particular direction in terms of our understanding. Maybe it's kind of hard. I think a lot of people do look for just the headlines. What can I put in the headlines in the first 3 lines before, people hit the paywall or whatever? And so I recognize the challenge of selling a story that actually gets traction. But then you run into things where, this came up with a friend of mine several years ago. I won't drag their name through the mud, because it's not, what happened was not their fault, and the person was really upset about it. But there was some, really bright 8-year-old kid or something like that came up with some theory, and so the parents were really aggressive at selling their child's, amazing gifts. And so they contacted someone who's really prominent, and he was like, "Oh, that's an interesting thing. He should, keep at it," which was kind of like a nice job, little boy. You're gonna do, keep at it, and you'll do well in life. Yeah. And it ended up being, this professor thinks that, this is the new revolution, and the child has now shown that Einstein is wrong, and it was one of those things where there really became a bit of a reckoning in certain circles about what do you let the press say that you said, and how do you. So, like, I always do the drafts of my own press releases specifically so that it doesn't get blown out of proportion.
Yeah, that's hard. And it's interesting you bring that up, because I started a whole separate YouTube channel which has, I don't know, I think I might have 25 subscribers on it, and I haven't uploaded in a long time, but I called it SciComm Hacks, and I noticed that scientists were having that issue among others when it came to communicating with the media, and they had a lot of questions about it. So that's why before I was doing media analysis, I was thinking about other things I could do, and that was actually one of the topics that I covered in one of my videos, was that exact issue. And what I used to tell the scientists that I worked with was, first off, if you over communicate what you're doing, in other words, you talk for 30 minutes about your stuff because you're just so, enamored with your work, or which maybe you're doing something very cool and maybe it deserves that. However, keep in mind that you have to understand the medium. So television, for instance, you're going to get maybe 90 seconds, 2 minutes for your story. Which
you have to know your audience.
If you parse it out, you're probably going to get 4 or 5 sound bites. So what do you want those 4 or 5 sound bites to be, and don't leave it up to them to decide it. So the story I always tell when I do trainings is, one time my husband, who's a human behavior expert, was brought in by my station to do an interview about, I believe it was after the Las Vegas shooting, but it was basically about threat analysis and human terrain mapping is basically what it's called. And so he first took the reporter and gave him like an hour primer on it. So he teaches sometimes weeks-long classes. He does one for law enforcement that's two days specifically, but he could go on and on. He used to teach special operations folks, so for 2 weeks, and so he's got a ton of a wealth of material. And so he goes in and he gives the reporter an hour primer, and they're like, okay, now we can start the interview. Now they've done that. So then the interview goes another hour. So then the reporter now has to log an hour's worth of tape, which now makes this was a night side reporter, so it's say 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock at night now. The story has to be on at 9. So he's got a couple hours to write, edit, do the whole thing, and he's just overwhelmed now with information. So he goes to his most base understanding of what my husband said. And so what's funny is my husband's least favorite phrase when it comes to what he does is see something, say something, because he thinks it's totally oversimplified. And
there you go. That's what they need.
And so what did the reporter do though? And the anchor said, okay, Greg, wow, this sounds like a really fascinating story. Just, what's the basic gist of it? And he goes, well, basically, it's see something, say something. And my husband's like, no, he's just ripping his hair out. How can he say that? I'm like, because you left it up to him to translate what you were saying. You have to always tell the reporter, like, I would never have said this as a reporter, right? Well, I guess I did, because I would tell scientists off the record. I mean, you don't want to go, like, as a journalist, it's, you don't want to say, hey, tell me what to say, right? That sounds very anti-journalism. But at the same time, if, say, in good faith, the scientists, you want to really understand what they're saying, and they want you to understand what they're saying. It's like, don't give me 65,000 talking points and let me choose 4. Let's figure out, like, what is the most important thing here. And if you're a scientist, like, if I'm just going to train you as a scientist to communicate, I'm going to tell you, understand you're getting 4 sound bites here. So what are your 4 main points that you want to make? And just keep hammering them, and don't go off topic, because sometimes reporters, especially younger ones, will go into interviews and they'll just ask a billion questions, and then they get back in their deer in headlights, and that's their fault. They shouldn't be asking questions for 2 hours if they know that they don't have time to understand the material and go through it that way. They should just say, I'm going to focus on this, and then that way also they're not over promising to the viewing audience, which is what they're going to get. So that's what I always say, is like, understand that if you're only going to get a few sentences or a few sound bites, and you just go in understanding that you need to tell the reporter, like, this is what my science is, and just stick to it. That's what every politician does, right?
Yeah. Well, and I imagine they get bored with it, and so I think what that reminds me or makes me think of is, 1, you have to know your audience, and 2, you have to know the filter that your audience is going to see you through. And so that's a good way to think about it. How long is a typical segment that someone would get?
Well,
it's like, if you have 90 seconds, then maybe 60 of that is going to be you speaking.
So say I just came to your lab and I was just focusing on your research. Your research will get the entire 90 seconds. But say it's you and maybe another scientist, or is it you and a utility person with the government? So say if we're talking energy, like, you're doing the research on the energy, but we're going to talk to a public utility district about how they're using it, or maybe even a homeowner about it, then you're going to start. So you split that. Now keep in mind, you're going to split that with the copy that the reporter is going to either voice or write themselves. So you have to think of the reporter as another interview in that sense. So now you've got, say you have 2 people that are being interviewed plus the reporter, that's 3 people splitting 90 seconds. And usually I would say it tends to be equal. So divided by 3, what is that? 30, 60, 90. I mean, so it's 30 seconds max. So that means 3 sound bites at about 10 seconds, because they're not going to let you talk longer than a 15-second soundbite is a long soundbite in television news. They usually cut your soundbite at about 10 to 12 seconds.
Wow, that's good to know. So what I need to do is read sentences. I need to practice reading sentences and seeing how long it takes me to read them. And then when someone contacts me, is to say, this is how many words I have to convey what I'm talking about. That's actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, that would save you a lot of headache. I do believe that part of the problem that scientists have is that they...
Logorrhea?
Yeah, they're just, the reality is, like, listen, it's not perfect, and even on YouTube, when I go 10 minutes, there are topics that I'm not going in totality about, right? We all have to make editorial decisions. We're all constantly making editorial decisions about what we say and what we do, and when it comes to communicating, we're not going to stay up 24 hours a day and just keep talking about things. But that said, if you go into something understanding that, first off, the time essence of what you're doing, but also how sound bites are picked. So if you're a scientist and you make an analogy that the reporter is like, okay, I can understand that, or there's one sentence you put extra emphasis on, or you really deliver with a punch, they're going to pick that stuff over when you're just kind of, run on sentences, lower your voice at the very end of the sentence. That's what a lot of scientists do. And they say, they talk very quietly. Like, I get a lot of science, back when I used to do those interviews, I'd say, are you scared of the mic? Because they may not be doing this physically, but this is how I feel like they're doing this. pulling away from the mic with the way they're talking because they talk like mice and you don't need to hear them. And I think another problem that scientists have too is there's so much peer pressure that a lot of people don't recognize is there in academics and especially in the science world. And so, what are my peers going to think about me? But the best scientists that I ever interviewed and who got the most traction for their work and frankly the most funding for their work were just like, I don't care. I'm just going to say what I'm doing. I'll collaborate with anyone. I don't care about the peer pressure. And they would get a lot of eye rolls from their peers, but I thought that was really interesting. The more I got into the science world, I was like, sometimes these people act like they're in middle school. The way that they
you mean scientists are just as human and petty as everybody else? I can't believe you would say such a thing.
It's cool because you think that there are worlds that you can just have total objectivity, and I've realized that I don't think that exists. That even in math or science or whatever, you have it's all done by people who have their particular life experiences and their viewpoints on A, B, C, D. And to say that doesn't in any way, shape, or form inform their work, I think would be naive. So it's not to say that's a bad thing. It's just to understand that that's the way it is. Mm-hmm. And then, not try to pretend otherwise. So I always liked the scientists that were willing to kind of own that and were kind of contrarian. I like contrarians. I like talking to people who question mainstream narratives and aren't afraid to do that.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of mainstream narratives, when you were in your trajectory through things, did you see that? So in academia, I joined a group called Heterodox Academy. I joined a couple years ago, which is basically so Jonathan Haidt that wrote The Righteous Mind, and so he made this group of basically faculty who are saying the fact that especially as you go to the Northeast, the fraction of faculty who will openly admit that they're conservative becomes vanishingly small. Yeah. That's not a good thing for the academy. That
it's same in the news business. I agree. It's unfortunate because I don't know the same in academics, but in the news business, a lot of things are they want to cast for the way people look. So when they think about diversity, they're thinking about diversity of how you look without thinking about diversity of opinion and background and culture and that kind of thing. Because you could have a group of people who all look very different but think very much the same. Mm-hmm. And I think that affects journalism as well. Having people in editorial meetings who have very similar, they went to the same schools, they have the same backgrounds, they think the same way, they vote the same way. And I think, it's just as important to have people who have different ideas about stuff because, you get what you kind of see now. There's, at the very least, you have a hard time understanding the people you're covering as a reporter because you're like, I've never met anybody like this before. People are nuts, and that kind of comes out, I think, in the reporting sometimes.
Well, because this is something that happens, I see, because I have a foot, I grew up in Utah. I have family where I'm on I'm not even on the extremes. Like, there are many members of my family who imagine me as having certain politics, but we talk about it, and they don't necessarily follow. But when one of them came to me and was like, "Oh, well, I know. I assume that you're a Democrat and this and that and the other," and I'm like, "No, I'm a proud member of no political party." But then also when I work with people and they just assume that I'm a Republican because for whatever reason, and I'm like, "No, I'm still a proud member of no political party." But I have good friends and family and everything that are basically on the sides of the mountain ranges that have the habit of calling each other Hitler. Like, so when my friends in academia and colleagues there are saying, all these people are fascists, I'm like, look, I know hundreds of people that you're describing here, and none of them are fascists. And it's, I don't know, it bothers me just because they don't know what they're talking about. I remember attending a conference with a couple other graduate students, and they're having a discussion, and they're like, I've never met a Republican, and I don't know that I would ever want to. I'm like, you haven't met a Republican, and yet you know all this stuff about them. It's amazing how you did that.
It's terrible.
And they're good people. it's just, I don't know, it bothers me how much people are willing to speak. Like, the stronger opinions people hold, the less they often know about what they're talking. In that, everyone who thinks differently than me must be a complete moron, because otherwise they would think the same things that I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they get very emotional about it because it's in their brain. There's not a whole lot of empathy. One of the things that I've talked about quite a bit on my channel is superiority, and what I learned as a reporter as superiority is really an illusion, because if you think about the fact that we really had no choice about who we were born to, and many of the circumstances we evolved through as children or even young adults, that if you can even if just a 1% chance, you can admit there's a 1% chance that, given you were born into the circumstances of your adversary, that you could have ended up exactly like them, thinking like them, believing like them, acting like them, then you may still disagree. I'm not a proponent of just there's no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as facts. Everything's just, I think people should speak up if there's something that is false or something that is true. It's just that it shouldn't be done with superiority, because you really have no right to be superior to your adversary, because you could have ended up just like your adversary had you been born to their parents, gone to their school, grown up with their brothers and sisters, with their educational background, their financial background, whatever, geographics, all that stuff plays into it. And many of those things we didn't choose. And I've sat across, because people will say, well, yeah, okay, maybe for some people, but not for not that murderer, not that poacher. But I've talked to a lot of people who have done some pretty nasty things. And really that was always in the back of my mind. Like, if I could have become a poacher, if I had grown up like that guy, if there was even a tiny possibility that I could have ended up doing that, given the fact that, we just were born in different circumstances, then I have no right to be superior to him. I can still say that poaching is wrong. Yeah. But I can't look at him and say I'm better than him. We're all just human beings. We're all, and maybe that also boils down to my religious perspective on some of that stuff. But like, I just think it's false to go around. It's an illusion. It oversimplifies things, like almost like, how when somebody dies in a terrible accident, one of the things that people will like, were they wearing a seatbelt, or they'll ask these questions about, and I think where that comes from is, okay, if I just do it this way, then I won't end up like them, right? Like, so because we're like all really afraid to die, and so we don't, so I think it's kind of the same thing. There's something under us that's just like, I don't want to end up like that, so if I just do all these things, then I just won't be like them. But the reality is, like, we all kind of have to admit that, I believe anyway, that we could actually have ended up exactly like them. Maybe that is repugnant to our sense of self, but to me it's just true. Like, I didn't choose to be born to do doctors. I didn't choose the environment in which I was born into, and so to look at somebody and say, I can still say, like, I don't agree with poaching, and that what that guy did was wrong, but to snub my nose at him and say, like, I have the moral high ground, like I'm a better human being in the very essence of who I am, I just think that is totally false.
It reminds me, so I watched a video. It would take me a while to drum up the name of the person I was watching, but it's a historian. It's a black historian. I don't remember what university he was from. He was talking about George Washington. And, let me give another example that's a bit kind of along those same lines. A lot of times Shakespeare is vilified to some extent because he left his wife his second best bed in his will. So he's writing his will and he's like, I leave my wife the second best bed. And I was like,
who did he leave the first best one to?
So I think it was his son. But so that one I don't know, but he left the second, and so people are like, this just goes to show that he hated his wife and this and that and the other. Well, it turns out, and I read that, I think it was Bill Bryson's book where he talked about this. I could be wrong, but I believe it was his, where he pointed out that usually in someone in his position, the best bed is the one that you basically put out on display in your house. So when a guest came over who was like a highfalutin guest person, they would stay in the best bed that you had. And the one that was in his bedroom was the second best bed.
Okay.
And so like the bed that they had slept in for however long they were married, that was the bed that he left to his wife. And a similar thing, so going back to the George Washington, is that so George Washington didn't emancipate his slaves as long as his wife was alive. And he's like, so, I turned my slaves, basically he turned his slaves over to his estate or whatever, but he didn't just free his slaves. And instead they came under the stewardship of his wife. And so people had pointed that out, and this historian was like, had he freed them when he died, he would only have been able to free those that belonged to him. And as a consequence of waiting until after his wife died to emancipate them, then they would all be emancipated. And it just shows that it's not, life is complicated, and sometimes understanding a bit more of the depth or the situation that someone finds themselves in gives you a bit more of a charitable perspective on them.
Yeah, and that's an interesting perspective too, like thinking about history, especially just context that long ago. I think like we're seeing a lot of anger at people from 200 years ago right now, which is interesting because I'm not sure anyone can say like that they know for sure what they would have been like 200 years ago. Given what they knew, what they were taught, or what they knew. This is why, like, I understand too, we in the United States, we talk about things a certain way when it comes to foreign policy, for instance. I mean, obviously people debate it within our own country, but we're going to look at American foreign policy sometimes differently than, say, somebody who's a smaller country that, the United States has looked at and said, we got our eyes on you and you better behave, or whatever. Like, depending on, what you're taught, what your governmental structure, what your social media platforms are allowing you to see, what is the majoritarian opinion on stuff, like all of these things, I think, affect what one then decides is, this is what I think, right? Like all of these, all of these things. And perhaps we have this belief that, like, no, we think this way because we have pulled ourselves away from the system and we've examined all things, and now we've come up with what is morally righteous. And I just, again, like I said, I don't say this to say that there's not such a thing as right or wrong. It's just if you think you're incapable of having done what you think 200 years ago somebody did, which was totally repulsive, or even somebody in 2021, I would rethink that, just because I think you're just as much of a product of your system as they are. And so if you can look at them and say, well, look at all these crazy things they think or whatever. Well, it's possible you think crazy. They would think the same thing about you, just depending if the roles are reversed. And again, like I actually think helps for debate, and good debate about right and wrong, truth and fiction, all that good stuff, because then you're not debating the value of the human that's saying these things, which I think, unfortunately, comes into a lot of the debates nowadays. You're just debating the ideas. And I think that's the best way forward is to say, well, let's talk about the actual ideas, which I think will help too we're seeing a lot of tribalism, not just politically, but with all kinds of other contentious topics right now. And each side, I think, a lot of times thinks that they, they're not only right, but they have the moral high ground. But that impedes the ability for any change. And just a quick anecdote too, like when I was in graduate school, there were some people who would debate ideas, and other people who found that if you wanted to even ask questions and have those debates, you were just so ignorant and anathema to the academic institution that you didn't deserve to even be here. And I'm sure, we could come up with many examples. That was, that was in 2006, 2007. So imagine how bad it is now. I can only imagine. But the reality, and that I realize, and I've said this on my channel also, as I've talked about some of these contentious issues that we're dealing with right now, is that if you, as you were kind of mentioning earlier, if you really want people to learn. You're like, I've identified this person as the kind of the adversary or the person that like whose ideas I'm debating against. If you want them to learn, the worst possible thing you can do is cast them out of your existence, out of your presence,
and show them.
Yeah, because how are they supposed to learn? I mean, there were a lot of things when I was in graduate school that, thankfully, there were people who were like willing to just say, maybe Alison's just never heard of this idea, so I'll talk to her about it. And I had the opportunity to change my mind because they didn't just say, oh my God, how could you possibly think that? You know, don't you know about this author and this author and Kant and Thoreau and, you know, and don't you know, blah, 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 blah. Because we were reading all of, you know, the original, like, you know, with Germanic, I guess, thinkers of that, you know, modernist era and like what they found to be true. So like if you didn't already have that beginning, like, well, God, how do you even understand postmodernism? And it seems silly almost that people talk about that stuff and get so irate about it in coffee shops, but that was, you know, liberal arts education when I was doing it.
Yeah.
It was just so dumb.
Yeah, it reminds me, so I read a book, I don't recall the book's title, but it was about basically the housing collapse and how the different, the people who were putting together these collateralized debt obligations, the CDOs, that the author was basically saying, you know, they make up really these words that are really technical terms specifically to make it so that you have this code that you can speak and you can tell who are the intelligent people and who aren't the intelligent people because they know how to use the word tranche correctly. And you know, astronomers do this too. Like I always tell people like, oh yeah, we use these big words so that we can, you know, there's going to be some kind of effect that we're going to name, and it actually just turns out to be, you know, tidal orbital decay or something like that. It's like, oh, this is the Darwin instability. It's like, oh, you mean it's the orbital decay because of the interaction with tides. But if you use it and you sound highfalutin enough, then you can kind of demonstrate to others that you're the knowledgeable person in the room. And everybody's got that ability to virtue signal, no matter what group they're in. You know, you all know the terms that you say to be, oh, okay, they know what they're talking about. You know, at the cocktail parties. So that's so I always try to make sure that we have those kinds of words so that when the time is right, we can shine forth to the audience that we want to cater to. And just so that, you know, the people that when I talk to people like little kids and stuff, I'll say, this is what we're saying, and it's a fancy way of meaning this. But I mean, everyone has the need to feel like they're important and they belong to something. And I am really troubled by how polarized academia has become, and I suspect that there's a lot of similarities with how polarized journalism has become. You know, if I don't know any other way to say it other than what I've given people advice is read a book from someone that you disagree with. So if you believe that all Republicans are, you know, Hitler, then here's a list of books from Republican authors where you can, you know, hear from their own mouth what it is that they're thinking. Or if you think that the Democrats are the same way, then here's a list of books that you can read. You know, just pick someone. I don't really like memoirs, but that's what I typically steer people to. Just read their book, and then you know, maybe it'll soften your position on how evil they are. Because this happened with like the recent Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett when she was put on, and I saw people just like freaking out, and I was like, you know, I don't know her, but I do know you. And if you were on an airplane and she came in and sat down next to you, you would have the most pleasant conversation that you probably could imagine. But the fact that that hasn't happened, you know, kind of is giving you this latitude to say things that probably aren't actually correct about this person.
Yeah, and I think the online world has probably aggravated a lot of this too because, people are scared, first off, that the mob's going to come after them if they, you know, say something that is any number of things that you can be labeled at this point in time, and in a way that people couldn't come after you 20 years ago. You know, you could say something stupid 20 years ago, and it was just something stupid, but now you can lose your job over it. And so I think a lot of people are very afraid. And then on top of it, it's kind of dehumanized conversation. So you're not looking across the table at somebody. You don't see that they're, you know, maybe they like Okay, well, here's an interesting thing I read about. That guy that was, the guy that everybody saw at the Capitol that was wearing the horns and the foxtail thing. I saw a tweet that like he wasn't eating in jail because he eats only organic food, and you're like, what? The guy that stormed the Capitol who wore the foxtail, he likes organic food, and so it's interesting because actually probably a lot of people that were like,
it fit right in Fremont.
Yeah, the people that are like extremely repulsed by his actions of storming the Capitol would probably also like organic food, So it just you can't necessarily box people as easily as we want to, and if you knew each other, like you can see their what they're saying on Facebook or in those extreme cases you see people that are making headlines or whatever. But yeah, I believe that even. Listen, I have literally talked to murderers, okay? I've sat, and even those people, I bet if we went through a checklist of things, like, we could agree on some things, And you're like, and these people have done some terrible stuff. Humans are humans. We are all, at the end of the day, like I said earlier, we're all subject to our unique experiences and the context through which we grew up. And so I think, for me, one of the ways to really solve where we're at with this tribalism is we have to put aside that you can disagree with someone's ideas without the person, him or herself, being evil and vile, as if you are somehow good. Like I said in one of my videos recently that I had a pastor who regularly said, there's no such thing as a good man. There's just men and a good God. And like, if we all just understand that, like, we may want to say, oh no, but that's a good person, that's good. But what does that really mean? Like, they're just a person. Like, people are just people. Ideas may be good or bad in the sense that, like, that's going to help, that's helpful, or that's not helpful, or that's true or false. But people are just people. And we're all just trying to figure things out, I think. And even, like I said, the people who have done some of the most grotesque things that I've covered as a reporter, if I could say, like I mentioned earlier, that given the circumstances that I could have ended up with them interviewing me in their situation, in their jail cell, then like, I'm just our fellow human. I'm just here to listen and understand what's going on. And not to mention, like, whatever happened to informing your own position better by talking to people who are different than you. Yeah. Even if just at the very least, you end up becoming a better articulator of your own position.
You sound a lot in that. I agree with you. The way that you're phrasing it sounds like what John McWhorter says. I don't know if you ever watch when John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry, so they talk every couple of weeks they do an interview with each other. So Glenn Lowry's he's at Brown University now, an economist from the south side of Chicago. He's something in his 70s. Then he went to MIT, and then, I mean, his story is like Tara Westover's story, in terms of like where he came from and then where he ended up. And John McWhorter is a linguist. Linguists, I guess, make the best public intellectuals. Like, if you think of Noam Chomsky and Steven Pinker, and John McWhorter he's a linguist at Columbia. And so they talk all the time, and they're both black, so they call themselves the black guys of Blogging Heads TV. And John McWhorter, they're both. Glenn Lowry's slightly to the right, which is interesting that he's at Brown, and McWhorter is slightly to the left. And McWhorter will say things, like, if I was in this neighborhood and my name was Omar, and I can think of his life and what he would grow up with, why he would have this particular worldview. And it's a good exercise for people to think, if I lived in that area. And even then, it's not really that hard to talk to people in that area, or to see what they think, or people that came from that area. Because even California, even Seattle, you still have 1 out of 5 people that would view themselves as conservative in Seattle.
Oh yeah, and it's been interesting to see some of the reaction to certain stories that have been done depending on the station and the reaction. I think you get a little bit of cover, at least there has been some cover in the Seattle proper area if you have kind of left-leaning bias. But more and more over the last few years, I think just as public distrust of the media has grown among conservatives, they become a lot more vocal about it. And so I've been watching, comments on my old station's YouTube channel, and I'm like, because Seattle itself, even like you were saying, there are conservatives who live in Seattle, but there are actually a lot of conservatives that live outside of Seattle.
Yeah.
They're still in that viewing
Marysville
market.
And Bellevue and
yeah,
Linwood.
Washington's a fascinating political landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Back when we were living in Central Washington, they were trying to basically divide the state as like the state of Liberty on the east side and
Cascadia,
state of Washington on the west. Yeah. And so, because there is kind of this, and Washington conservatives, I think, tend to be sort of more kind of leave me alone conservative, in the sense that I don't know if they're necessarily what you would consider your classical conservative, but
they're definitely like the libertarian,
yeah, definitely more so just like leave me alone kind of person. And so
and I don't like libertarian isn't necessarily the right thing. They're definitely the leave me alone, stay out of my life.
Just I don't want to mess with you, just don't mess with me kind of person.
It reminds me that someone showed a video of the Bundys. Is it the Bundys from Nevada? The people from Nevada that kind of hold themselves up, and the guy was wearing a hat that said BLM on it, like FBLM. And the people were saying, I can't believe he would do that to this racist person. He's like, no, that's the Bureau of Land Management.
Right.
So it's like a completely different world in terms of like what their interaction with the feds are and what their interaction with the government is. And that strain, it's an Intermountain West type, like Mountain Man type kind of view of the world.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like, you think about the famous cases like, Ruby Ridge, which is right in Idaho, I believe. Oh God, what was that guy's name?
I don't remember the Ruby Ridge guy's name. The Westfield? No, that's not it.
I'm gonna look it up.
Randy, I think, was his first name. And then there was also like in Waco.
Randy Weaver.
Weaver, that's right.
And Waco. So it's just interesting because you tend to think of like conservatives are like pro law enforcement, but these guys were very skeptical, and especially after what ended up happening with the FBI and everything. So yeah, it's a very different. But actually, I'm starting to see that kind of turning anyway, even in the more populist conservative side as well, because I think we're looking at a very different movement in both political parties. I do think there's a populist version of either side that and sort of more squishing the mainliners. Closer to what they were, almost the mainliners are kind of looking more and more like each other, and then the outliers, in some cases they're very different, but in other cases they're very similar. And so it's an interesting time to be alive. But what you were saying about the media and how that's affected journalism with just increasing polarization and whatnot, I think one of the things that has affected journalism, especially like in an area like Seattle where it's very easy to fall prey to groupthink and to also be afraid to speak differently, because we definitely have like a history of mobocracy in Seattle, right? So it's like, we're
You mean it's only been a couple decades since the last time a gigantic mob went through and destroyed all the businesses in downtown Seattle?
So it's like, people are like, okay, just leave me alone. So journalists, I think, in that area are probably even more prone to it. So it's just something that people have to think about is just, all right. And managers especially too, I think newsroom managers have to be aware of their effect of bringing out different viewpoints and expressing themselves in a way that allows for their employees to feel comfortable. And I don't know, there's probably some kind of, analogy there or relationship with what you see in academics, but like I think that news managers sometimes they set the tone, and so if they're mocking a person in a political party or something, publicly, or cheering after an election goes their way or something, well, what do you think your journalists are going to do? You know, and I think I saw in, and I know this is different in local news, it can be a little different depending on what market you're in. I mean, if you're in a super conservative market, you might have a very different experience, but like Seattle is very liberal and or I should say expressly liberal. I wouldn't say, like you were mentioning, there are plenty of conservatives in the area, but they don't really speak up. They're kind of a hidden group. And that was kind of that was reflected, I think, in the newsroom. I mean, there were people that had these secret little conversations in the cafe, or you knew that guy in engineering was a conservative that voted for Trump or whatever. But generally speaking, that was a subculture that people they would test out, like, are you safe to tell? And so, which is kind of dumb because, like, that's happening outside the newsroom walls, and people, the same thing, that people
they
are
learn to speak it. They develop a code, right?
Yeah, we're not helping them. We're not helping people have conversations with each other and debate each other's ideas if we are actually we are scared. We ourselves are having secret conversations. We ourselves are afraid to challenge homogeneity of ideology and whatnot. And
I'll give you an example. So there was a story that I heard. This didn't happen at my institution, but and it goes to show, like, what a manager, like the role that a manager can play that is helpful or conducive to setting the environment for everybody. Is there was, I guess, some law professor who was a constitutional law professor, and he was conservative, and it really bothered some of the other people, and so they would, like, this one person was all bent out of shape. And went up to the dean and was saying, we need to do something to get rid of this and not let him do this, speak these things. And the dean's response was, it's okay if there are 5 conservative constitutional law professors in the country. And it's also okay if we have one of them.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, why not? I guess I think it doesn't make any sense to me if you're somebody who comes from a field that you're supposed to be exploring ideas, even if the purpose is to reinform, like, a perspective that you're like, I'm never changing my mind on this, okay? Which I think is dumb for people to do. But let's just say, like, you have the ultimate truth. If you're going to be communicating to people, why not inform your position with all of the potential challenges to it that you can possibly find, and have those conversations and not be scared of them? And to me, it's unfortunate, just because, like, think of all the ability, like, to go back to, again, graduate school, where I started seeing that happening. Like, think of the person that could have actually really learned from your ideas if you hadn't mocked them or kicked them out of your circles and not given them a chance to learn. How are people supposed to learn? Are we supposed to be born, out of our mother's wombs with
all the knowledge?
I mean, how are you supposed to learn? That's what you're supposed to do in school, right? Is you're supposed to go to college and learn, not just shut up and repeat ideology that you don't really believe, right? Maybe some people are like,
yeah, you can tell when you let the ideology speak for you, because all of a sudden the language gets narrowed down.
Yeah, and like you were saying, I mean, there are instances that I saw in seminary where, like, people just became atheists because they were like, I didn't know about all that stuff. So if you're teaching something, or you think something that's very shallow with what you've been told about that issue, then it's only a matter of time before somebody comes up with a better argument, and then you're like, oh, well, maybe I was lied to this whole time. So it's the best way for somebody to kind of maintain their position, I think, is to be challenged regularly, because then they don't wake up one day and say, oh, I just had the wool pulled over my eyes. I didn't realize that they were teaching me all these things. And then you become an extremist on the other side, right? Because you have a digital life, right?
Digital life that's either on or off. So I know that you're pressed for time. So why don't you give me a piece of advice? Like, what do you think the best way forward is for maybe individuals, and maybe what you'd like to see in terms of, I guess, all of these things? What kind of improvements would you encourage people to make, both in their own lives and how they relate to the issues of the day, and also in terms of the institution that you are from? What can they do? Where are the places that people can turn for a more expansive worldview? Let me put it that way.
Well, to answer that last question, I think hopefully the internet and people like yourself we'll be able to continue talking about this stuff online. And I have found myself to be far more informed about what's going on now that I do YouTube versus when I was in mainstream media. Far more informed. So I think having the opportunity to seek out podcasters and YouTubers, Twitch, whatever, and just look for stuff. You have to ultimately take the onus on yourself to explore the world. Nobody's going to do it for you. But we're at we may be bombarded with tons of information right now. But to me, it's like you never had more opportunity to explore different ideas than we've had in the past. So I think it's a great thing. It's such a big question what people can do that I tend to go very micro on this one, because I really believe that you could seek out all kinds of information and you could force yourself into situations where you're meeting different people, but if your own posture is not, if you're in a hyper emotional or really, you're just angry and chomping at the bit about something, that stuff might just go way over your head. So I always tell people, because like people ask me often, like, well, how do you reform journalism? And I go straight to like the journalist and say journalists have to start doing some real self-reflection, have to spend some time in quiet. And that's ultimately what I tell people. Take some time away from this stuff and spend 5 minutes in quiet, like detached from all of the insanity around us, and start like looking inward a little bit. I really believe that we're at a point in history where we've never been more distracted. If we want to take the phone to the bathroom with us, we can, right? We never have to have any quiet time, none. Like, to just hear our thoughts and how frenzied we can be and all that stuff. So I know it seems maybe kind of like, not related, but that is always where I start, is like, is really kind of removing yourself from the stimulus for a little bit.
It's almost like if you were to take, say, 1 day a week where you didn't participate, and just like detached yourself a bit more, and
or 5 minutes in the morning,
10
minutes in the morning where you just sit in quiet, just have a cup of coffee and close your eyes, and just take a few deep breaths. But then on top of it, I think once you get yourself to a place where you're starting to calm down a little bit, you're not, in a constant state of arousal, then my next is go and start having real relationships with people who are different than you are. And it can help to read books and listen to people online and whatnot, but it never will take the place of actually knowing your neighbor. So I always say, like, get to know your neighbor.
Real friends are greater than virtual friends.
Yeah, that person that you unfriended on Facebook or whatever, that lives down the street, maybe go ask them if they want to go out for a cup of coffee and talk about some stuff. And maybe don't even talk politics, just talk about anything. How's your kid doing? Where do you get your groceries? Because I'm really into food, so I like to talk to people about farming and food and stuff. And where do you buy your meat? Where do you what rancher around here does grass-fed beef or whatever it is? Like I don't even talk to them about the stuff that could divide us. I try to say, like, what are we interested in? Let's just talk about interesting things. And then you realize, like, wow, there are a lot of similarities and we have a lot in common, on a very basic level. Now you can start talking about, like, the stuff that maybe is going to make, you get a little bit aggravated. But but I say start with yourself, move to your neighbor, and then explore the world. Those are kind of my 3 steps.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with those. That getting off of the dopamine loop and into the serotonin loop, and having contact with. I'm looking forward to getting back to, like, real face-to-face conferences and stuff like that, because there's so much more to personal interactions than what you can reproduce through electronic devices.
Absolutely.
And it's better for people's mental health. I think we're seeing how people can kind of fray when they lose contact with other humans.
Yeah.
And so, well, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for spending your part of your day with us. And at some point in the future, if we want to talk science specifically, I'm always open to that. But I wish you really good luck in your endeavors, especially living up in the cold in
Thank you.
in where you do now.
It's sunny and nice today, but yeah.
Yeah, well, it's supposed to get up to 70 here, so.
Well, we actually have been thinking about moving to Nevada, so we'll see. I'll stay tuned.
Yeah, well, if you decide to do that, I have some I can hook you up with different places to consider.
Sweet.
All
All
right.
right.
Thanks a
I'll
lot.
take you up on it.